Have you ever walked away from a conflict convinced you were the problem? Maybe you thought, I'm too much, I'm too sensitive, or even I'm impossible to love. For many people with ADHD, these thoughts are surprisingly common, but they don't just come from one place. Today, we're going to look at three different forces that can create these thoughts and two steps you can take to start breaking the cycle. I'm Dr. Badiee, psychologist and professor. Let's get into it. One of the most under-discussed aspects of ADHD is emotional dysregulation. It's actually the topic of my previous video, which I've linked from in this video. And essentially, emotion dysregulation is what it sounds like. When we have unpleasant emotions, they can become out of control. They can feel really disproportionate to the situation as well. So, in a nutshell, it's a struggle to navigate unpleasant emotions. And it could be difficulty navigating the intensity of a difficult emotion, like having a reaction that's very explosive, or the opposite, shutting down and being unable to communicate. It could be a struggle to navigate the duration of an intense emotion. So, the feelings still linger long after you want to forget. And it could also look like getting easily distressed, easily irritable, easily angry. Sometimes people are referred to as being hot headed or short tempered. Emotion dysregulation can also show up as just completely blowing up, having times where you just completely blow up and say things that you regret. It could be sobbing uncontrollably. And all of these, as you might imagine, can link to relationship difficulties if they're unchecked. If we work on them, that becomes a different story. But if they are unchecked, they can definitely become a problem in relationships. In fact, with ADHD, the emotions can feel so intense that people will do impulsive things to cope with them, like engaging in drugs or alcohol, engaging in sexually risky behaviors, or even in self harm or self sabotage. So, even though it's not in the diagnostic criteria, there is lots of evidence that people with ADHD do have emotion dysregulation. Most notably, that shows up in studies of the brain where they see the parts of the brain, like the amygdala, that are linked with emotion regulation being different in those with ADHD. So that does lend itself to the fact that there is a biological basis for why people with ADHD have relationship issues. But to those of you with ADHD, just know that it's not that you're too much. It's just that our brains work differently. But again, we can work on them, which we'll talk about in a bit. If you're enjoying this evidence based content, subscribe for more thoughtful, culturally informed perspectives on ADHD and mental health. Back to emotion dysregulation. Although emotion dysregulation is not technically part of the criteria that we use in the US to diagnose, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Disorders, the DSM 5. There's enough studies now that have shown this link with emotion dysregulation in people with ADHD that scientists are concluding that emotion dysregulation is actually what underscores the other symptoms of ADHD. Think about it. Impulsivity, right? Maybe difficulty coping with big emotions. So you have to act out in some way. Irritability is another symptom of ADHD. Low tolerance for frustration is also another aspect of ADHD that, again, is related to this emotion dysregulation. And also just the inability to sit with boredom. It's hard to do tasks when you are not interested in it. And as an adult, you have to do things you're not interested in, right? So that becomes challenging when you can't, it's hard to tolerate things that are boring. And it can also impact our relationships. So we know that the brain it works differently for those of us that have ADHD, but what about the environment? There's very few things that are just one thing or the other that are just genetic or just the environment, and ADHD is no different. The way that it's going to show up in terms of symptoms and the way that people are going to experience it and the intensity of it very much also relates to the environment. So we're going to talk about that as well, how the environment can also show up in our ADHD. One way that can happen is through trauma. Trauma is very common with people who have experienced ADHD. In fact, one study estimates that 44% of adults with ADHD do have some kind of trauma from their childhood. But correlation is not causation, right? So just because two things are linked does not necessarily mean that one is causing the other. There could be a third variable that's causing the differences or causing the relationship between the two. So, trauma is definitely an important environmental factor in people with ADHD, childhood trauma specifically. But there's another environmental factor that's also important in ADHD, but it is even more of an outer layer of the environment. It's part of the structural conditions that we live in, the systems and institutions and everything that we all function in and that we're part of. We live in a world that is very neurotypical. We live in a world where we're expected to conform to rules that were created by people that are neurotypical. And so the world really isn't designed for the way that our brains work. And because of that, we often get mistreated. And so we live in this neurotypical world that we're expected to function in. We try really hard to meet those expectations, but we also, a lot of us get this sense that we are continuously not doing that. We are continuously not living up to people's expectations. And that is so upsetting for those of us with ADHD, especially people that were socialized as girls and women because we were taught to always take care of others and to put other people's feelings above ourselves. And so we sometimes, especially those of us who get diagnosed later, which is really common with people assigned female at birth, that we get diagnosed a lot later in life. And so we sometimes have a lifetime of disappointing others. It's really hard. It's a big struggle and something that a lot of people with ADHD feel really, really guilty about, that they don't meet others' expectations, whether that's relationships or tasks or anything. So an ism like racism, ableism, those isms means that there is an institutional systemic component. It's not just that someone experiences discrimination, which anyone can experience discrimination for any identity, but ism means that there are structural conditions in place that reflect that same discrimination. So, for example, someone might work in a group with lots of people with ADHD and they could feel like they're being discriminated against because they don't have it, but that person is not experiencing ableism because there's not a systemic pressure, a systemic and institutional basis for what that person is experiencing. At the institutional level, it's people with ADHD that are lower on the hierarchy, that are mistreated, and that the institutions and the systems that we're part of that. And so that is more of an ism. It's kind of like the difference between if you have a day with some clouds versus the climate in general is very stormy and rainy climate. So that's really the difference, that something that's an ism is going to be repeated a lot in different contexts in somebody's life. And so ableism is the institutional systemic oppression that is faced by people who are not able bodied. And so, what does that actually look like for people with ADHD? Well, a whopping 89% have reported discrimination for their ADHD. So, that is pretty high number, about 9 and 10 almost. And what types of discrimination do they experience? Well, a big one is, do you really have ADHD? Because you don't act like it. Because the stereotype is little white boys running around. They can't calm down. And that's the hyperactive sort of stereotype. And if you don't meet that, one, you're underdiagnosed, but two, people don't might not even see it as valid. So do you really have it is a big one. Or there's negative stereotypes about people with ADHD, like that we're always unreliable or even that we're dangerous. So there's negative stereotypes out there. And what does science tell us about that when that does happen, when we do experience more discrimination? Well, there's a theory that's been demonstrated in lots of different studies, including as related to ableism, called minority stress theory. And minority stress theory is the idea that yeah, if you are a minority in some way, then you are, yeah, sure, your mental health is worse, but it's not because of the disability necessarily. It's because of the discrimination and the systemic and institutional oppression against you. And so there's been lots and lots of studies that have demonstrated this, that the more discrimination a person feels, the depressed they are, the more anxious they are, the more they might doubt themselves. And so that's been shown in lots of different ways. And people with ADHD is no exception. There's a very deep harm that can happen that can impact our mental health. So, looking at all three tendencies, we've got emotion dysregulation, we've got trauma, we've got ableism. If we look at all three of these and think about how those may impact people, is it any wonder that those of us with ADHD struggle more in relationships? And unfortunately, research does back that up because people with ADHD report more relationship dissatisfaction, more conflict, a higher chance of being a victim of interpersonal violence, even, and more divorces. Obviously, none of this is caused by the ADHD necessarily, but the things that we were talking about that can contribute definitely can impact how we behave in relationships. And so, none of this is to say that we are not capable of being in healthy relationships, but we might struggle a little bit more. But don't give up hope. Stick with me, and we are going to discuss some strategies. Pop quiz: emotion dysregulation, trauma, and ableism. Three very different experiences. One surprisingly similar outcome. What is it? They can all leave us with negative feelings about ourselves. The tendency to just beat ourselves up. Think about it. Each one of these in isolation. Emotion dysregulation. If we're blowing up, if we're shutting down, if we're saying things that we wish we wouldn't have said, we feel guilt, we feel regret for things that we said, for actions that we took. Some of that might be appropriate. If we have said something that was harmful, then we've done something that's harmful, we do need to take responsibility. Feeling guilt is appropriate in that situation, but I'm talking more about when it's excessive guilt, excessive regret that we're ruminating on it. We can also get really stuck fixating on what we feel like we did wrong, quote unquote, in an argument, just ruminate on what we said and obsess over it. And when it comes to trauma, trauma teaches us to internalize negative views about ourselves and also about other people. So things like I'm dirty, I'm gross as a person, or I can't ever trust anyone. These are common beliefs that people have when they have experienced trauma. And what about ableism? One thing I'll say about ADHD is that it is an invisible disability, which is important because sometimes when you have an invisible disability, there are situations where people don't know, right? You can pass potentially, not everybody can, but you can potentially pass as someone who is neurotypical, who doesn't have ADHD. And there is a little bit of privilege in that. You get access that someone with ADHD might not get access to. But there's also a pain in passing as well for some people where they might hide it, but if it is something that's important and they feel like they have to hide it, that can cause some distress. And because it is an invisible disability, other people don't necessarily believe it. If they can't see signs of it on you, they are like, oh, I don't know. Do you really have it? And so what happens to the person then? I don't know. Do I really have it? Maybe my ADHD isn't even real. And so that is one way that that can show up. And also, people report that once they do share about their ADHD, they are treated differently sometimes. And so that makes them close up about it in the future. Many people decide not to disclose that to people unless they really, really, really trust someone. They will keep it to themselves. And that might be fine for some people. Some people, they don't really want to share it, but it can be hard for people who do want to share it and feel like they can't because they're going to be judged negatively. So, internalizing those negative stereotypes, someone could actually start to believe, like, oh, yeah, I guess I am just lazy. I guess I am just destined to fail. But our negative self beliefs, ugh, they're so rude. They trick us. They trap us into a spiral of shame. They make us think everything is our fault. They tell us we should put up with way more than we actually should. This may all sound very gloom and doom, but as I promised you, there is some good news. These are tendencies. They aren't set in stone. And with practice, we can learn to stop believing the lies that these negative beliefs tell us. And we can also, with time, change how we respond. So, how do we begin changing these beliefs? I'm going to talk about two main steps, and they sound very simple. I would say that these are steps that are going to take months to implement. But the two key steps are start noticing your critical thoughts, and two, talk back and be sassy. The first few times, you're not going to believe your sassy response. You just won't. But over time, the more you do talk back, the sassier you are about it, the more that will lead to bigger shifts. So let's discuss how to talk back to three common thought patterns. Emotion dysregulation.
I can't believe you got upset with your partner again. You're the worst.
What? Getting upset doesn't make me a bad person. My emotions can be intense, yeah, but I can choose how to respond. Trauma.
What's wrong with you? Why can't you just get over it?
Nothing is wrong with me. These are understandable responses to trauma, and healing is an ongoing, unfinished process. Ableism.
Everyone else can handle conflict without taking a time out. Why can't you?
So, I don't have to do relationships the same way other people do. Taking a time out is what helps me show up as my healthiest self. The strategies we discussed are based on principles of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. If you're looking for a therapist, CBT can be helpful if you have ADHD, and you can ask the therapist whether they incorporate it into their work. So, what other topics would you like to hear about with ADHD? Thank you for watching and have a wonderful day.